What if I told you that failure was an integral part of gaming and actually made it more enjoyable? Welcome to a grim discussion, where we take a look at the psychology behind video games and their mechanics. Today, we're talking about the art of failure. If you've ever played a Souls game or a difficult platformer, you're probably a little too familiar with the frustrations of failure. You keep replaying the same level over and over again, trying your best to win, but the game just won't let up. And the more upset you get, the more it feels like the game is mocking you. Except, what if it wasn't? What if the game is actually trying to help you? What if it's trying to teach you something? It's a bit counterintuitive, I know, but just go with it for now. You see, the first thing we have to talk about is the difference between implicit and explicit teaching in video games. And this is a crucial part to good game design. When a game tells you to hit spacebar to jump or press E to use an object, that is explicit teaching. The game is actively trying to teach you something and you're actively trying to learn it. But implicit teaching is different. Implicit learning is subconscious and dictated by your environment. Basically, you learn by doing. And since implicit memories are usually associated with events, emotions, and of course, failure, they're generally stronger. That's why you never forget how to ride a bike or how to swim, and that's the idea. That's why when you're playing a fast-paced platformer or you're on your last sliver of health against a boss and you're under all this stress, you still manage to use what you've learned and make it through. You don't have to overthink anything or weigh dozens of options in your head, you just do it. So, alright. Games want us to fail, so we retain information better, especially under stress, but wouldn't constantly failing frustrate the player and make him perform worse? Well, no. At least not always. First, it's important to understand that not all failure is created equal. A study was conducted that found that all the players preferred games where they failed, and their performance did increase. That was only the case when the player felt personally responsible for the failures as well as the victories. And that's where games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls truly shine. Every death is your own fault, and the game rarely feels like it's cheating you out of a well-deserved victory. You constantly feel like you're learning something new to help you on your adventure every time you die. In Bloodborne, for example, you have a chance to regain some of the health you've lost if you attack the enemy back fast enough. This forces you to weigh your options and carefully consider risk and reward. It goes completely against everything you've learned so far, and forces you to make a conscious choice and effort in a game that relies so heavily on reflexes and implicit memory. But we also have to take into account the difference between getting to and having to do something. In Bloodborne, out of about 40 bosses, only about 8 are actually mandatory to beat the game. In fact, the very first boss you fight isn't even a mandatory boss, you can skip it entirely. But the Souls series isn't the only one to do this. A lot of games will have some sort of side content or other missions and bosses you can fight if you get stuck in a certain section. The mentality of getting to do something and being able to move on whenever you get stuck or bored changes everything, because that's when self-imposed challenges come into play. At that point, you're not trying to win because the game is telling you to, you're trying to win to prove that you can. And in some cases, to regain a sense of control. Every time you get a little bit closer, it gives you a burst of motivation to keep going, and that's why giving players a sense of freedom and self-imposed challenge is so important. It's one of the few times when failure can actually improve performance and effort. And puzzle platformers like Hue are great at this too. They generally use intrinsic motivation, meaning playing and beating a puzzle is the reward itself. Now, yes, the motivation of playing video games is generally intrinsic, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that when you include games like Bloodborne, or a lot of RPGs for that matter. In most cases, you probably don't do all the side quests or kill all the optional bosses just for the sake of it, you do it for the reward that's at the end of the tunnel. The motivation is extrinsic. Now, I realize that this is a gross generalization. I'm sure there's plenty of people who do this for the sake of the experience, but I think it's fair to say that most people probably don't do all the side content just for the sake of it. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, why don't games use extrinsic motivation all the time then? Well, that's because that's when failure starts to come into play. See, because you're doing it only for the reward, repeated failures have a higher chance of discouraging you and lowering your motivation. In a paper published by Princeton in 2003, Roland Benebow and John Trelone described extrinsic motivation and its rewards as only a weak reinforcer in the short term that may have hidden costs in that they become negative reinforcers once withdrawn. Which basically means you're only motivated so long as the effort doesn't outweigh the reward. So, alright, but then how do games bring out this intrinsic motivation, and why does it make such a huge change in how we perceive failure? It all comes down to challenge and the illusion of choice. The game needs to give you a sense of emotional investment and make you feel personally responsible for your failures. In a puzzle game, this might be the challenge of overcoming an obstacle you previously couldn't, whereas in a Telltale game, this might be your investment in the characters and the illusion of choice surrounding them. It's one of the reasons why some games give you a difficulty setting. When you get to choose how much of a challenge you're comfortable with, you're more likely to be intrinsically motivated to beat the game. Failure can and should be used as a motivator and a learning tool. Without this sense of failure looming over us, we'd have no reason to improve and no reason to motivate ourselves. Take Darkest Dungeon for example. Failing in that game holds one of the worst penalties of any of the games discussed in this video. Your characters die permanently. This is the ultimate failure, and without this constant sense of dread as you go through room after room fearing that the characters you've grown so invested in might be gone forever, you'd have no reason to be careful. You'd have no reason to manage your stress levels or bring sufficient supplies. You'd never learn when the right time to dim your torches, and the game just wouldn't be as much fun. The game teaches you to double think every action you take and properly manage everything. It's a lesson in patience, self-control, and personal boundaries, and just how far you're willing to risk everything you've worked for just to get a few items. And that is the art of failure. Thanks for listening.